Here's a historic photograph of a wonderful Southern Plains Cheyenne teepee. The lower part of the buffalo hide teepee is decorated with diamond shapes, and the top is a solid color. Native Americans often decorated their teepee poles with horsetails. This teepee is probably about 17 or 18 feet from front to back. At first, it actually looked larger to me before I noticed that the people in front were actually children, except for the adults squatting next to them. Notice the grass surrounding the teepee. The Great Plains is known as an ocean of grass, and all life depended upon it. You may notice that I have the word teepee spelled different ways throughout this presentation. There are actually three ways to spell it: T-I-P-I, T-E-P-E-E, and T-E-E-P-E-E. All three are correct. Teepees, as we think of them today, did not appear on the Great Plains until the early 1700s, but in 1541, the Coronado expedition described the teepee's precursor. They do not live in houses, but have some sets of poles which they carry with them to make some huts at the places where they stop, which serve them for houses. They tie these poles together at the top and stick the bottoms into the ground, covering them with some buffalo cow skins. From what was learned of these Indians, all their human needs are supplied by these cows, for they are fed and clothed and shod from these. Archaeological evidence of teepee rings show that these proto-teepees existed for thousands of years. Notice that the size of the proto-teepee isn't mentioned here, but given that the only beast of burden was the dog, these proto-teepees were relatively small. Now let's take a look at four-legged transportation in the Great Plains. Before 1680, the dog was the main beast of burden. With a travois, a dog could drag about 40 to 60 pounds. This, of course, helped to limit the average size of teepees, and they were less than 12 feet in diameter. And with a dog, of course, you have limited daily mileage as compared to a horse. And the people that the Coronado expedition ran into are known to be small game hunters and gatherers. But in 1598, the Spanish came up from Mexico and entered present-day New Mexico along the Rio Grande River and enslaved the New Mexican pueblos. And by 1625, horses began to appear on the plains. These are the horses that the Spanish brought with them. Now, the Apaches found uses for the horse. They began to steal horses and raided pueblos. Even in one raid, they stole over 300 horses. And then Comanches began acquiring horses from the Apaches. In 1680, there was a great revolt against the Spanish by the Pueblo peoples, and they kicked the Spanish out for about 10 years. This is also known as the Great Horse Dispersal because the Pueblo Indians, being a sedentary farmers, they had no use for a horse, and they simply let them go. And of course, the horses headed toward the Great Plains where all the grasslands were. And so the horse population, left alone, would double every 4 years. And the Plains Indians were able to integrate the horse into their cultures quite well. The Comanches were the most successful at integrating the horse into their culture, into every aspect. The teepees became large. They became, now on average, about 18 feet in diameter. And they had increased goods. It took 3 horses to move one teepee and the furnishings in the teepee. So, and their mobility, of course, dramatically increased. Now, this wasn't just any horse. Let's take a closer look at the Spanish horse. The horses that the Spanish brought to North America were not the usual horses we think of today, such as the quarter horse or thoroughbred. These were Iberian Mustangs. Let's take a look at how the Iberian Mustang got to the Great Plains. They were original to the steppes of Central Asia. The steppes of Central Asia were very similar to the Great Plains. They were most famously used by the Mongols, who were considered some of the best warriors on a horse. When the Moors expanded east toward Asia, they eventually were able to acquire the Iberian Mustangs for their own use. Later, when the Moors invaded Spain, they brought this Mustang with them. Now let's take a look at the important differences between the Iberian Mustang and horses the pioneers used. The Iberian Mustang is 14 to 16 hands tall. Now, a hand is 4 inches. It's been standardized to 4 inches now, and is a measurement from the ground to the top of shoulders. A pony is less than 14 hands, and Iberian Mustangs are 14 to 16 hands, so they are not ponies, but they are small horses. And they weigh about 750 pounds. Grasses are a perfect food for them. They do not need grain. They can live on grasses all year round, and they can become a working horse and be fine with just eating grasses. They don't eat any grains. They can forage in the plains winters. Snow doesn't bother them. They can get right to the grass itself under the snow. They're very smart, fast, and trainable. And they have extreme endurance. I have not been able to find out how far an Iberian Mustang can go in a day, but I was thinking that it wouldn't be hard for an Indian group to travel from one tribe to another friendly tribe, and trade out horses and just keep on traveling. They could probably travel extreme distances, and I know their endurance is probably at least 50 miles a day. And the quarter and draft horse, they are much larger horses. They are 16 to 17 hands, and they can weigh 1,100 to 1,500 pounds. The draft horses were huge. They were used to often pull giant wagons across the prairie schooners across the Great Plains. They eat many more calories than just grass, and they need lots and lots of grain if they're going to become working horses. In fact, even left on their own without being a working horse in the winter, they would starve to death because they couldn't get enough grass. Compared to an Iberian Mustang, they have very little endurance. They can go about 20 miles a day, and that's it. Since the Comanches ended up dominating the southern plains, let's take a quick look at their history. In pre-horse days, they were a typical hunting and gathering people in southeastern Wyoming with a population of about 5,000. They had a very, very simple social structure. They concentrated on just survival hunting, small game, and gathering plants, and they occasionally killed larger game. Now, agrarian cultures like pueblos developed very complex rituals and a rigid social structure. The Comanches never did. They were very egalitarian. Authority over one another was virtually non-existent. The only place where authority was recognized was in hunting and on the battlefield, and that was earned through respect of success. They did not have any government. Instead, they had councils. These councils were quite amazing. They were very courteous, and these people had very extraordinary oratory skills. They dealt with migration, war, peace treaties, and welfare. Now, their religion was very non-judgmental. They had only a very little magic, but no visions, religious dances, or rituals. They were often called atheists of the plains. And when the horse arrived in Wyoming about 1625, they quickly adopted it and expanded their territory, but their social structure never changed. They were always egalitarian. Now, after they became the horses mounted, they were the mounted raiders of the southern plains. They swept through the southern plains and conquered. Mostly, it was the Lipan Apaches, and they lived in semi-subterranean houses and were agrarian. They're very easy to conquer for the Comanches. Now, the Comanches had an extraordinary affinity with horses. I remember reading one story about how they would capture them near a watering hole. Wild horses would come to the watering hole. The Comanches would lasso them, force them down to the ground, and practically choke them to death. And then they would release the lasso around their neck, and the horses would breathe in. But when the horses breathed in for the first time, the Comanche would breathe out of their breath, out of their lungs, into the nose of that horse. And this somehow imprinted that Comanche on that horse, and they were instantly bonded. And no other tribe in the southern plains, or even the northern plains, had any kind of affinity like the horses and Comanches did. Only the Comanches bred horses in the entire plains. No one knows how they got these skills, but they even had geldings, and they had extraordinary language for describing various kinds of horses in specific horses within their herds. And this allowed them to have astonishing mobility. They could fully exploit the buffalo. And by 1706, all the Great Plains tribes were mounted, and the Spanish recorded the first attack by Comanche at the Taos Pueblo. And the Comanches quickly ruled the southern plains. This painting here on the right is a George Catlin painting. He made 5 expeditions in the 1830s to the west, including some to the Comanche tribes. And the Comanches were well known for doing this. They would, in the war, they would hang on the side of the horse and shoot arrows underneath the horse's neck, using the horse as a shield. Now, they were able to shoot over 20 arrows in the time it took to reload a muzzleloader. And these arrows were accurate up to 30 yards. This was quite incredible. In 1834, Richard Dodge, a colonel, called them the finest light cavalry in the world. George Catlin, who painted this painting, said on their feet, they are one of the most unattractive and slovenly looking races of Indians I've ever seen. But the moment they mount their horses, they seem at once metamorphosed. I'm ready without hesitation to pronounce the Comanches the most extraordinary horsemen I have seen yet in all my travels. When the Comanches established themselves in the southern plains, they called their home Comancheria. Now let's take a look at the borders of Comancheria. Here on the west, it ends at the mountains. They were constant at war with the Spanish until a New Mexican governor, Batista de Enza, decided that he realized he cannot be a permanent peace with the Comanches until he's able to deal with just one chief. So he picked one of the chiefs, his name was Greencorn, and only dealt with him, gave him lots of trade goods, and the other chiefs started relinquishing their power to him as far as their relations with Mexico. That way he could deal with one person and establish a peace treaty, and he did. It actually worked. And this peace treaty lasted until the end of the Comanches. So they had no problems in the west, really. In the south, it was noticed that the end of the plains, in the beginning of the desert, that is where the southern border is, and there was much, and the pressure would come from Mexico. In the southeast, the pressure would come from the Texans, and in the east, the Texans would of course come in and take their land, and then the Comanches would start attacking the settlers, and this caused very, very much bitterness with the Comanches. But notice the north-south border here on the eastern side. It's approximately the 100th meridian, the end of the grasslands and the beginning of the woodlands. Now in the north, the border is still grasslands. This is about the Arkansas River Santa Fe Trail area. The reason they did not expand further north is because the Indians in the north really were jealous of the buffalo herds in the south. Even as late as 1869, there could have been as many as 60 million buffalo in the southern plains. This was an extremely rich area for buffalo. The buffalo in the southern parts of the plains were a little bit smaller than the ones in the north. And but the northern Indians wanted the buffalo very much. So the Comanches were first attacked and put pressure upon by the Kiowa and Cowapache Indians. But in the late 1700s, the Indians were able to make a peace treaty because of a Mexican rancher who was friendly to both the Kiowas, Cowapaches, and Comanches, was able to make a peace treaty between them. then the Comanches welcomed the Kiowas and Kiowa Apaches into Comancheria. They became their first allies. Later, the Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho attacked and wanted the buffalo and tried to work their way into Comancheria. There was a constant warfare, but the Comanches pretty much outdid them, but they were able to come to a treaty again. And this treaty, they also allowed the Southern Cheyenne and Southern Arapaho to become part of Comancheria and share the buffalo. And this also strengthened the Comancheria against the white intrusion by the Americans into the north and from the east. So they were pretty stable on the west, very unstable in the south and in the east, but they had these new allies that helped keep this Comancheria area steady. Comancheria was their home, but they actually controlled a much larger area. Comanches considered it a birthright to raid the peasants of northern Mexico. It was very profitable for them, and they could also replenish their numbers by kidnapping children, usually around the age of 9 or 10. Now, it's estimated that at one time there were as many as 40% of the Comanches were at one time Mexican children. The Great Comanche War Trail came down the present-day Big Spring, Texas, and then divided into two main trails that headed into Mexico. The Mexican government practically conceded the territory to Comanches. Now, you won't find it in the history books, but it really made the Mexican War much easier for Americans. Comanches even raided further south than this. One anthropologist told me they raided into present Belize in Central America. Comanche war parties were known to have been gone as long as 2 years. But the traditional time of raiding into northern Mexico was in August. And whenever you heard the term Comanche moon, that meant August, because that was the time when Comanches would come down into Mexico and do their raiding. So we've seen how the Comanche came to dominate the southern Great Plains. Now let's take a closer look at the teepee itself. It can be considered to be a permanent mobile home, consisting of 3 parts: poles, cover, and liner. As you can see in this diagram here, I have an equilateral triangle with the dots superimposed over a teepee. So the teepee is not an equilateral triangle in the silhouette. It is a tilted cone instead. It's always tilted toward the back, toward the wind. The prevailing wind is always put to the back of the teepee. Now this tilt centers the fire under the smoke flaps and lets the front teepee poles brace against the prevailing southwest wind. I think that teepees are quite photogenic at every phase of their construction. Here I just put up my teepee poles and laid on my back and looked straight up and took a picture. It's quite a beautiful shot, I think. I have lodgepole pine teepee poles. They are considered the best. They are not from this area. They are from the Northern Rockies, so they had to trade to get them. And one horse traded for about 5 lodgepole pines. And to demonstrate just how valuable they are, there's a great story of Rachel Parker. She was kidnapped by the Comanches, and in the early years, you're treated like a slave until you finally learn about the Comanche culture, and then you rebel and get established as yourself. Then, she got in a big fight with this one lady trying to establish her own identity, and they broke a teepee pole in this fight. Lots of stuff was destroyed, but the only thing that the people cared about was the breaking of the teepee pole. This just demonstrates how important teepee poles were and how big of a hassle it was to get new ones. Now, you can also get red cedar trees and fir trees to be used as teepee poles, but they're not quite as good. And it takes usually about 12 to 24 poles per teepee. My base teepees have about 13 poles plus some other smoke flat poles plus some other poles. And now each pole needs to be about 3 to 4 inches in diameter is a good size. and they need to be 21 to 25 feet tall usually. Mine are 22. And it's pretty easy to make a teepee pole. You just chop one down, pick a straight one, chop it down, strip it, and let it cure for about 3 weeks. It's true that Southern Plains Indians had a use for every part of the buffalo. Even the buffalo chips could be used like firewood since they had the indigestible parts of the grass in them. But with the killing of the buffalo, men's contribution to the making of the teepee cover ended. After the buffalo was killed, the women's role began. Usually the hunt happened early in the summer because the hides had less hair and fat on them, to make it much easier to process. They usually were cut along the spine, neck, and haunches, and then the hide pulled off. And from here, the horses were used to transport the hides to the village for further processing. Once the hides were transported back to the village, the hides were staked out. As you can see in this picture, there's probably half a dozen hides staked out, and they are stretched very, very tightly. And the bone and stone tools are used to flesh the hide, which means just to scrape the flesh, fat, and blood off of the hide. And then it's left in the sunlight for many days. And then they mix the brains of the buffalo and the liver grease and basswood bark, soapweed, and water, and start rubbing it in with a smooth stone. And then it's left in sunlight again, stretched and rubbed several more times for softness and suppleness. After the tanning process, the women got together once again and had a kind of a quilting bee. They used parts of the buffalo to do this. They used the sinew from the buffalo as thread, bones as needles, and these covers always had an even number of hides, and at this stage they were white and opaque. Now, the next step was to smoke the cover. This would waterproof it and also make it very translucent. To smoke it, they would simply put it up on the teepee poles like they would normally, except they would build a fire inside and close the teepee cover up completely around the poles and just smoke the heck out of it. And that would make it very waterproof and also made the leather quite soft. And the life cycle of the buffalo hide would last about 2 years. And the constant smoke for 2 years, going through especially the top of the teepee, would make it extremely soft. And they would, once the cover was worn out, they would still use these parts, especially at the top, to cut into clothes and liners because they were extremely soft. Now let's take a quick look at the Comanche women. They owned almost everything they made, including teepees. They set up the teepee in about 30 minutes. It takes me about an hour and a half. They were much better at it than I am. They owned the horses for transporting a teepee. They could divorce a man easily just by putting their moccasins outside the teepee. I always thought this was a myth, but I've run across it several times. Women fought, mostly defensively. They could join war parties, and they were as good as riders as men, but it was at a great cost, which was miscarriages. They were very highly valued as childbearers. And they had really big population problems. They had 30 epidemics before 1820. Just 3 of those epidemics, the smallpox and cholera, have their population. And so they took to kidnapping during raids to help offset their high death rate. So you can see why they were very highly valued as childbearers. Teepees are actually very versatile. Once they're set up, you don't have to leave the cover totally enclosed and just have the door open. You can also adjust it any way you want. Like in this picture, they have the teepee cover pulled back so some sunshine can get in. And one of the covers is pulled like halfway through so they can have some privacy behind this cover. So they have both sunshine and privacy and darkness in the back. So teepees can be quite adjustable to whatever circumstances you have at the time. You can also combine teepee covers into one large canopy or windbreak. Here you can see two teepees are crossed over together, overlapped, with lots of teepee poles supporting it, and they're having a council. Liners are the last major part of a teepee. These are usually used just in the winter time because it really helps to manage smoke and fire in the winter time. But in the summertime, you don't really need a liner so much because you can just lift up the sides of the teepee and get a breeze. But in the wintertime, you want to keep it closed. And with the fire, the liner is really, really good about managing the smoke and fresh air coming in. Well, the liner is simply tied along a few places along the teepee poles. A rope is made tied along the top of where the liner you want the liner, and then the liner is tied to the rope, and then it hangs down and goes in parallels with the teepee pole down to the ground, and then comes back in toward the center of the teepee for about a foot. So it's pretty airtight except for at the top. And the reason you want that because of the cover of the teepee is up usually a few inches to let fresh air in, and the fresh air comes in off the top of the liner and comes over toward the center of the teepee and down into the fire. And any smoke that is created by the fire is always kept above the level of the top of the liner. That way people can move around pretty much smoke free even though they may have a smoky fire inside. This also manages the heat really, really well. The heat is kind of maintained below very well as it gets narrow as it goes to the top, even though there is a smoke hole at the top. It also is good for art. You can put all kinds of art on the inside of the liner. And it's good for privacy at night too, because when you have a fire inside, of course, you're silhouetted and you can see on the person on the outside can see everything that's going on. So the liner helps prevent that and gives you privacy. This schematic gives us a good idea of what it's like inside a teepee. This teepee is about your average size. It's about 17.5 or 18 feet from the eastern side to the western side, from the doorway to the back end of the teepee. You see it's rather oblong. When you first walk in, you'll notice that there is firewood on your left and cooking utensils. And on the right-hand side, there is riding equipment. I might mention that the Comanches, Kiowas, Kiowa, Apaches, and Southern Cheyennes often did use saddles, but they were usually the Spanish-style saddle or a saddle of their own making. They did not particularly like the Western-style saddle that cowboys use. This is also a good illustration here of the gap between the cover and the liner, with the teepee poles separating them. This is where the air comes in and feeds the fireplace. Now, the place of honor in the teepee is the back bed on the western end of the teepee. This is where the owners sleep. There is usually a backrest on either end of each bed in the teepee. These other beds are for their children or in-laws or sister-in-laws, whatever it is. And so occasionally you'll find a altar of some kind honoring some kind of god or animal or something like that. And there's storage areas just anywhere you can find it between the bed and the teepee liner or between the beds themselves. But the open area around the fireplace is always kept open. So provide open area to get around in the teepee. Now I might mention that there's also a lot of pipe smoking going on these, and when they do pipe smoking, they usually form a circle inside, but kind of leave the area in front of the doorway clear. And once the pipe is passed all the way around to one end of the circle, it's passed all the way back around without anybody smoking it to the beginning again. It's not a good idea, or it's not traditional to pass it across the opening of the doorway. That would not be kosher. In the interior of a teepee, you'll usually find two kinds of furnishing, a parfleche and a backrest. The parfleche are usually just folded up boxes made of rawhide, and you can unfold them and place them right, and there'll be a large box for storage. The rawhide is a wonderful material to work with. It's one of my favorite materials. You can get all kinds of rawhide. You can get it all crinkled up and everything. You can get it wet, and if you straighten it out when it's wet, flatten it out, it will, in dry, flat, it will stay flat. You can just sew it with sinew real easy, and it's very easy to paint and decorate. You can also decorate little leather straps. And the backrest, I've never made one of those. Those are usually made of willow reeds, usually about 120 or so willow reeds per backrest. And these are just stripped and dried for a few days and just woven together. You can sit on they leans up against a tripod, and the bottom of the backrest comes back under your bottom, and then you can lean up against the tripod in the backrest. That will support your entire body weight. This is a good illustration of the importance of a liner in a teepee for privacy at night. You can see the line of it going from the bottom to about 6 feet up, and this prevents any silhouettes and people spying on you from the outside. So it gives you quite a bit of privacy. And it's also a good illustration of the gap between the ground and the bottom of the teepee cover. This is where the air comes in to feed the fire. And it's really quite photogenic in itself at night. And I just love this picture. Comanches usually did paint their teepees, but unfortunately not very many of them have survived. They had a very bitter war with the Texans that lasted for several decades, and the Texans were very bitter enemies of the Comanches, and they just tended to burn everything they could every time they attacked a Comanche village. Might mention that George Catlin came through and did paint some Comanche, made paintings of Comanche teepees, and they generally had red images of them. There is one beautiful Comanche teepee in the Denver Art Museum, and I have seen it. It's quite amazing. And they also have some clothing, and there's some in Oklahoma here. There is not very many painted teepee covers of the Comanches. And something to keep in mind: those old photos of teepees are black and white, and only paintings have color, and not all the paintings can really be trusted to be quite accurate, because they often would make sketches and then paint them 3 or 4 years later. Now, so we have very few painting covers that existed past the 1870s. In 1895, however, James Mooney interviewed Kiowa, Apache, and Southern Cheyenne elders for their old cover designs, and they made models of these teepees. These were very important designs, and generally designs are considered to be sacred, and they belong to the tribe or family because someone had a vision of them. So I tend not to like to paint my teepees any kind of guessing of what the tribe might have used, unless that tribe is extinct. Like I was thinking about painting a teepee with just membrace designs on them, but they're from Arizona, and there weren't any teepees in Arizona, and that culture is long gone. So I don't think it'd be offensive to anyone if I painted a teepee made of membrace designs. Here are some photographs of these small models made in the James Mooney study of the old Kiowa covers. You can see they're quite beautiful. They often had on the outside a line or designs of like a moon or a sun, and lots of animals. Just quite beautiful. And here's an example of some of the Cheyenne covers from the James Mooney collection. In the 1990s, a couple of anthropologists studied historic photographs of teepees and teepee villages. There were about 400 photographs they examined, and they looked for features other than teepees within the teepee villages, and also how different teepee villages were organized. And first, let's take a look at some of the features associated with individual teepees within the teepee villages. Some of these features include hearths, drying racks, teepee frames, shade structures, travois, sweat lodges, hide processing areas, medicine bundles, even miniature teepees. Let's take a look at a few of these. Hearths are more often accompanied by tripod poles for suspending cooking pots over the fire. By far, hearths most often appear in front of the teepee and less frequently beside, behind, and in a communal area, or even inside the lodge. Here in this picture, we see a hearth with a tripod for cooking inside the teepee, but the cover is open. As seen on the left side of this photograph, drying racks consist of upright supports with horizontal cross pieces, which were used to dry meat or other food. 56 identified racks in these photographs, 55% were beside a teepee, and only 14% were in front, 7% were in communal areas, and about 4% behind a teepee. Now, in the other side of the picture, there's a teepee frame. Frames are structures that are similar to an erect teepee, but they seem that they lack a cover. Of the 40 depicted frames, 82% cannot be associated with an individual teepee or communal area. 12% stand in front of a teepee, and 3% are either behind a lodge or in a communal location. The purpose of these is unsure, but they're certainly used for activities, as you can see in this photograph. After arriving at camp, the Indians needed a place to store their travois. As you can see in this picture on the left, there are several stored together. They are stacked in a teepee-like fashion next to a teepee. This is the way most are stored. They are also stored in other photographs just leaning up against the side or back of a teepee. If shade was needed in a teepee village, travois could also be used to create a shade structure. They would put two travois across from each other and lean them against each other and string a teepee cover between them from above and let them hang down and provide shade. The historic photographs of the teepee villages showed several sweat lodges. This sweat lodge is rather special here because there's no cover on it, so we can see what's going on inside. You can see how small they are, the man sitting there. There is a hearth in the middle and a cairn, presumably of rocks that would be hot and thrown into water to make the steam for the sweat lodge. In the 400 photographs, hide processing areas appeared in 15 images. Most of these are in areas beside a teepee, about 46%, or in front of a teepee, about 13%. And tanning hides as a group activity is illustrated in about 13% of the photographs. When examining the 400 pictures of historic teepee villages, the authors realized they could also classify the different camps into four main categories. There were group camps, which are rather unpatterned, cluster camps, usually teepees of greater than 30. Circular camps, which are circular around an open plaza and more of a traditional tribal circle ceremonial camp. There are also linear camps arranged in one or more straight lines. Group camps are an unpatterned arrangement of less than 30 teepees. This camp type was the most commonly encountered, appearing in 42% of the photographs. Such camps appear to be comprised of interrelated groups, such as extended families, or are associated with specialized activities, such as hunting. Cluster camps are defined as an irregular arrangement of teepees clustered in groups. The camp type was the second most frequent, appearing in about 15% of the images. In contrast to circular camps, cluster camps do not appear to be associated with ceremonial activities such as Sundance. No communal ceremonial structures were observed in any of the photographs of cluster camps. The function of cluster camps remains undefined. Circular camps, as its name implies, consist of a circular arrangement of teepees surrounding an open plaza area. This arrangement is the tribal circle referred to by ethnohistorians and is often most associated with ceremonial activities. The circular camps account for about 5% of the photographs. Such camps were often large. Some were recorded to be over a mile in diameter. Circular camps are also systematically arranged. Each family, band, or group had a pre-assigned location in the circle and did not vary. Linear camps have teepees arranged in one or more straight lines. This camp type was identified in about 4% of the photographs. Now, many of these camps were not aligned along a riverbank and did not have any visible topographic restrictions as one might expect. The arrangement may have been a recent phenomenon or may have been increasingly popular through time for unknown reasons. The authors also analyzed the doors, covers of teepees, and communal features in the teepee village. They found that 70% of the teepee doors faced the same direction, wind probably being the determining factor. Now, there were several methods of securing teepee covers in descending order: pegs and logs, sod, and rocks. And there are 5 types of communal features within a teepee village: council lodges, communal shades, Sundance lodges, women's lodges, and medicine lodges. At this point, I should note that while the southern Comancheria tribes, the Kiowa Apaches, the southern Cheyenne, the southern Arapaho, practiced the Sundance, the Comanche did not. So there were no Sundance lodges in Comanche villages. In fact, the Comanche were nicknamed the atheists or anarchists of the plains. While this is an inappropriate use of the term, it is true Comanches had very few religious ceremonies and felt absolutely no need for self-torturing ceremonies such as the Sundance. Actually, the difference in attitude can be found in their backgrounds. The Southern Cheyenne, for example, were farmers before the introduction of the horse. While they adopted the hunting lifestyle, their complex agricultural rituals and mythologies were not abandoned. They were merely adapted to their new lifestyle. Comanches, coming from the simplest hunting and gathering society, never had a need for complex rituals or mythologies. Now, let's take a look at the Comanche teepee itself. It is a 4-pole construction. This Comanche teepee here is from the Comanche Reservation in Oklahoma. Notice the wider base and shorter height. It befits the short stature of most Comanches, who are usually about 5'4", 5'5". To maintain or grow a prairie, there must be the mechanisms to prevent many shrubs and trees from overgrowing a prairie. Herds of millions of buffalo grazing and fires caused by lightning are 2 of the more natural ways prairies are maintained. But with the introduction of the horse, we can also include it. The grazing and herd activities kept invasive plants controlled. Also, the practice of moving a teepee village every 3 or 4 days with the herd of several hundred or even thousands of horses helped to keep invasives in the prairies controlled. It is also known that from time immemorial, people have started fires on the prairie for hunting and defense. So the addition of mounted people with teepees and horses onto the plains is believed to help maintain the prairie. By the late 1870s, most of the Southern Plains Indians were restricted to reservations. On these reservations, they were given canvas teepees to replace their buffalo hide teepees. The canvas they found to be lighter, the teepees could be made larger, and canvas was actually quite accepted as a material for new teepees. Teepees still play a role in archaeology. One lesser role are the teepee poles such as found on the left. These are lodgepole pine poles. A ranger found them laying on a national land And he noticed that they were lodgepole pines, and there are no lodgepole pines that grow naturally in the area, so they must have been brought in, probably by someone using a teepee. Now, on the right is a much more common occurrence of teepee rings. There are literally millions of these going from Canada all the way down to the Texas Panhandle. They're about 5,000, all the way back to 5,000 years ago. And they range from about 2 meters to 9 meters in width. And there are probably used to hold down the flaps of leather on either the liner of a teepee or the outside cover of a teepee. Teepees have world relatives. What's two of the most common ones are the Siberian chum and the Sami goatee. Now, the Sami goatee are, of course, in the northern Norway area, and both of these are way above the tree lines. So I imagine they probably had to trade or make trips to get the poles for their structures. Interest in teepees is still strong in modern days. As you can see, people are taking teepees and doing all kinds of interesting things with them as far as their decorations. Some of them are quite outrageous, like this peppermint stripe one here on the left. And the one on the right, I believe, is a camp at Disney World they have every year around Thanksgiving. And there's a big teepee convention. They have teepee contests of putting them up. And it's all quite fun and interesting. Teepees are quite an attractive thing to have around, and people love to talk about them. I couldn't resist showing a few slides of a wreck involving teepee poles. These look like unfinished poles being hauled in a trailer, and someone behind the poles wasn't paying attention and failed to brake and ran right into the back end of the trailer, with the teepee poles poking right through their windshield. The teepee poles continued through their back window. I should mention that no one was hurt in this wreck, believe it or not, but it does show that you got to be real careful around teepee poles. In Santa Fe, New Mexico, there was an art exhibit called Future Ancestral Technologies by the American Indian artist Canupa Hanska Luger. Now, this artist envisions a future where the technologies of the past, such as the teepee, are melded with current technologies or technologies of the future. Here he has a teepee with very light telescoping metal poles, and these are combined with solar panels on the smoke flaps, and there are even some material. The material of the teepee is even different. I don't know what kind of material it was. I did not get a chance to see this exhibit. It opened up right when the coronavirus pandemic started, and so I had to close right back down. But this just goes to show that people see quite a bright future for teepees. I threw this slide in to honor an old professor in Boston mine, Dr. Jack T. Hughes. This is his teepee on the left. He invited me to stay in it with him as we camped in this area and for an archaeological survey of Interstate 10 near Iran, Texas, and Fort Stockton, Texas. He was one of the most brilliant people I've ever met. As I mentioned earlier, there are two types of teepees, a 3-pole and a 4-pole. The 4-pole is for shorter folks like Comanches, because the teepees will be shorter and wider. And the 3-pole are more narrow but more tall, more conducive to like the Cheyenne and Arapahoes. So I have a 3-pole teepee. Here you see my teepee is being set up in my backyard. How I got to this point, I have a circular rope that have 3 marks on it, one for the door pole, which is on the lower right, and I have a north and south pole on the back. And so I have markers in the ground where I want the base of these poles to be. Once these poles are set, they cannot be moved. If any other poles you set up in the teepee may be moved, but not these. If you mess with these, the whole teepee will be off kilter. The way I got this 3 poles set up this way is to put the 2 back poles, the north and south poles, together, put their bases together, lay them down, put the door pole on top of them, tie them together with a constrictor knot, lift up all 3 of them together, separate the north and south poles, and put the north pole where the north pole dot is, leaving the south pole steady. And then just let the rope hang down, and you're ready to add more poles. As you can see, the above the apex of the triangle here, we have the cone. We have 3 V's connected, and my teepee poles will go into each of those V's. Each side between each poles will go in each V, and those poles can be moved once they're set up. In the next step, I took the rest of the teepee poles and placed them around the teepee and the V's at the top of the cone. Then I took the rope that was hanging down and went around the teepee on the outside and put the rope around it 4 times to tie all the poles together. And then I simply hooked the rope to a smoke flat pole, which will be used later, and brought it up over the door pole that's hanging toward the back of the teepee, and brought it straight down and pegged it into the ground. You can see there's little flags on top of the poles here. Those are mostly just for show and to help keep the birds away. Here's a close-up of the apex of the cone. You can see where I went around with the rope 4 times, and then brought it around the door pole, which is hanging off to the left, and brought the rope over it, and then straight down into the ground where it was staked. The next step in putting up a teepee is putting up the teepee cover. To do this, you have a lift pole, the last big pole, and you lay it down behind the teepee, and you put the cover on top of the pole, and then unroll it till it ends about 3/4 of the way up the pole, and you tie it at the top, and then tie the teepee cover to the pole about in the middle. Then you take the teepee pole and tie it to the cover, lift it up and twist it around 180 degrees so the pole goes in first and leans up against the other poles. Then you come back and you undo the knot that holds the cover to the middle of the pole, and you bring out each side of the cover to the side to the front, and you tie them together in the front with lacing pins above the door. I might mention at this point that one time I did it so badly that I ended up putting it in inside out, and that was quite embarrassing. When you bring each side of the cover towards the front from the back, you hook it together with these lacing pins. There are no knots needed. You just need holes in the cover right there, and you just place these long lacing pins through there. Here's a look from inside the teepee right after putting it up. You can see that the lacing pins are in the bottom middle here, and the apex where all the poles come together is in the upper right with the smoke hole in between. And you can see the cover is quite wrinkled. This wrinkling usually goes away within an hour. And on the upper right, you can see the edge of the liner. The liner comes up about 5 feet, I guess. And there's simply a rope running around between the poles where I have a mark on the pole. I just looped a rope around each pole and tied them toward the door poles, and then attached the liner to the rope. And so it's pretty easy to put the liner, but it is a little time consuming.